Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series, and happy Halloween. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore. Community Bookstore will be celebrating 50 years in business this fall, and we credit this milestone to the support of readers and writers. So thank you very much for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to be partnering once again with our friends at New York Review Books to welcome Hernan Diaz, Roxana Robinson, and Ed Simon for a panel discussion of Edith Wharton's collection Ghosts, newly reissued from NYRB Classics. Now to some housekeeping, we've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe setting. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, click the transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, also on the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We'll be asking those at the end of the program, so don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them as quickly as possible. And we've scheduled a whole host of fall programming for you, so do head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is next Tuesday, November 2nd. We're thrilled to welcome Yotam Ottolenghi and Noor Murad for their new cookbook, Ottolenghi Test Kitchen Shelf Love, in conversation with Bon Appetit Editor-in-Chief, Don Davis. That program's up on our website now and taking registrations. Now a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Hernan Diaz is the author of 3 books, most recently the novel Trust, forthcoming from Riverhead in 2022. A finalist for a Pulitzer Prize for fiction and the PEN/Faulkner Award, he is also the recipient of a Whiting Award and edits an academic journal at Columbia University. Roxana Robinson is the author of 10 books, 6 novels, 3 collections of short stories, and most recently, a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. 4 of these were chosen as New York Times notable books, 2 as New York Times Editor's Choices. Ed Simon is a staff writer for The Millions and a contributing editor for the History News Network. He's the author of several books, including Pandemonium, A Visual History of Demonology, forthcoming from Abrams in December of this year. He will be moderating tonight's conversation. So now, without any further ado, I hand it off to you. Hernan, Roxana, Ed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. So what I thought would be a kind of appropriate way to begin the evening was I have a short section from the preface that I'd like to read. And this is slightly redacted, so hopefully I have done Edith Wharton fair in terms of how I put everything together. But I wanted to start with this to give sort of a sense, I think, of the philosophy that motivated Wharton as I read it in the preface. And then to use that to kind of launch into a conversation about both her ghost stories and kind of the idea of haunting itself more generally. So without further ado, but since first I dabbled in the creating of ghost stories, I have made the depressing discovery that the faculty required for their enjoyment has become almost atrophied in modern man. Ghosts, to make themselves manifest, require 2 conditions abhorrent to the modern mind: silence and continuity. Mr. Osbert Sitwell informed us the other day that ghosts went out when electricity came in, but surely this is to misapprehend the nature of the ghostly. What drives ghosts away is not the aspidistra or the electric cooker. I can imagine them more wistfully haunting a mean house in a dull street than the battlemented castle with its boring stage properties. What the ghost really needs is not echoing passages and hidden doors behind tapestry, but only continuity and silence. For where a ghost has once appeared, it seems to hanker to appear again, and it obviously prefers the silent hours, when at last the wireless has ceased to jazz. These hours, prophetically called small, are in fact continually growing smaller. And even if a few diviners keep their wands, the ghost may after all succumb first to the impossibility of finding standing room in a roaring and discontinuous universe. So there's obviously a lot going on in that passage, and I'm very much curious to hear what both of you think about those. So I guess maybe in a more general sense, and then I'd like to kind of get into the stories themselves and Wharton's place herself, though avoiding spoilers maybe, I guess, for our listeners out there. But how much of what Wharton says, perhaps ironically, but I'm not sure, do you think bears out? How do we understand her point today?
Well, I think that she, Ed and I were emailing about this, and one of the things about Wharton is she's an enormous snob. She's a great writer, and I admire her enormously, but one of her positions in the world is that she knows more than everybody else, and she is sort of superior to other people. And she is always doing this. She's always saying, it was better before. The old times were better. And so when she's writing about ghost stories, she's saying, alas, modern life has no place for this kind of wonderful spiritual engagement that is so powerful, but it's all going by the boards with jazz and electricity. There's no room for ghosts. But I think she shows in these stories that that's not true. That's still every one of us knows what it's like to be awake in the small hours in the dark. And no matter what modern conveniences surround us, there's still that sense of being alone in the nighttime as a human being that evokes fear. And she does that in these stories so brilliantly. And one of them, I don't want to give a spoiler, but one of them does involve the radio, and she evokes fear so brilliantly and brings the modern world into it that she's kind of contradicting herself.
Do you think she's conscious of that contradiction? Is there something tongue-in-cheek with the preface, or?
I don't think she's tongue-in-cheek. I think she's very magisterial. She says, this is how it is. And if you asked her why she used that same modern device in a story which she just said couldn't contain modern devices, she'd say, I used it for my own purposes.
Gotcha. Well, Hernan had actually mentioned the radio, and that's in
All Souls.
Yeah, and Hernan, you had talked a little bit about how there's a sort of tension with modernity in these stories, kind of the sense of disenchantment, maybe. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this, and thanks the New York Review of Books. I'm such a huge fan of the New York Review of Books classics, and it's a thrill, which is a Whartonian word in this collection, the thrill down the spine. But it's a happy thrill to be here, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in. For sure, it seems as if Wharton's conception of the ghost is antithetical to modernity. And it seems almost that what she's giving us here is ghosts of ghosts. It's as if she is mourning the passing of the ghost. And what we have here is some sort of meta ghost, sort of the ghosts that are not possible in this modern world. And as I was reading this beautiful preface from which you quoted, I was thinking of Max Weber and this idea of disenchantment of the world that is inherent to modernity. What does this disenchantment mean? Well, it means that now reality is measurable, quantifiable. It is the result of reason. It's something that can be charted by reason. And there is no room, it seems, for imagination, which is something that she highlights immensely when she talks about silence in the preface and the radio and movies also. What she regrets is that this modern life overflowing with stimuli has taken away the power of imagination. But there's also an interesting, the preface you quoted from starts, and the whole book in effect starts, if I may quote like three lines. The opening sentence is, "Do you believe in ghosts?" That's how the whole thing starts. Do you believe in ghosts is the pointless question often addressed by those who are incapable of feeling ghostly influences. I will not say ghost seer, always a rare bird, but the ghost feeler, the person sensible of invisible currents of being in certain places at certain hours. And I think here is the anti-modern, or the thing that is in friction with modernity. There is a reality that depends on feeling rather than something that can be corroborated empirically. And this is anathema to modernity.
I think that there's an interesting kind of jumping off point there. And Jack Hansen wrote a very smart consideration of Wharton's ghost stories in the Baffler that came out a few days ago. And just there's a short line from it that he writes that, then specifically talking about Wharton's stories, the trouble isn't the ghost, but what the ghost reveals. I was wondering if you could maybe, respond to that, either one of you, and kind of think a bit about how that relates to what Hernan was saying about this sort of aspect of her stories that's antithetical to modernity, how we think about meaning as conveyed through these stories.
Well, I think modern philosophy, especially, the arc, and that appears in the Baffler story, and I'm a little weary to get too sort of academic-y here, but I think the piece goes back to Hegel, but also we could talk about Marx and the famous specter, that haunts Europe in the Communist Manifesto, and centrally in Derrida, which I would prefer not to discuss, because I think that sort of Derrida makes everything that he touches ugly and joyless. So, but
tell us what you really think.
but there is something very productive in modern philosophy, and I use the word with great deliberation. There is something very appealing about the figure of the ghost, because it puts into question this is what Derrida calls the hauntology, sort of the metaphysics of presence, the idea of essence and then physical manifestations of those essences, of phenomenon and noumenon, and the sensible and the intellectual. And ghosts, of course, are these liminal presences that are there but are not there simultaneously. And this puts in tension and puts in crisis this whole idea of the metaphysics of presence. And that's why I think ghosts have this privileged role and presence in modern philosophy. I don't know if this is answers to what you were asking, but or addresses it even.
No, it does, and I think it's interesting because so often, and this was my first time reading these stories, was a sense that the ghosts had a very sort of she's such a beautiful writer, but they played a traditional ghostly role in a lot of ways too, right? Like they kind of revealed hidden aspects of things, or they gestured towards some sort of significance that the reader isn't aware of necessarily, and that the characters aren't necessarily aware of till later on in the story. And I think that kind of idea of a world that's pregnant with meaning, right? That seems almost, well, it's explicitly pre-modern in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. And to go to something that Roxana had said when we were emailing back and forth, but there's something about that seems, to be inherited from the Puritans to a certain extent. And that Wharton is an author who, despite her close connection with New York, is kind of a New Englander at heart as well. Obviously spent time in New England, was obviously familiar with the great New England writers. And one of the things, and Roxana, I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to quote the email that you actually sent, which I should have given you like a heads up for that, I feel, but it was incredibly well written. And so
I wrote it, I own it.
Yeah, you say that you described the sort of relationship of Puritanism to Wharton's work as this rigid and unforgiving ethos of morality, terrifying in its adamance. So I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about some of, I guess, Wharton's, hidden or maybe not so hidden Puritanism, specifically as it manifests in these stories.
Yeah, so she wrote at some point in an interview that people had supposed that she was influenced by Henry James, and she said she wasn't influenced by James. She was that the big influence on her was Hawthorne, and she was surprised that people didn't see that. And it does strike me in many of her works, and particularly in this book, that she is reiterating over and over of this very strict rule of morality. And in these stories, most of them contain a crime that was committed earlier. And the ghost represents that crime and a way of either presenting it to the world or presenting it to the person who has seen them in the story, the eyes. The person who sees the eyes is the person who commits the crime or may commit the crime. So there's a very strong moral code behind these stories. It's not random. It's not that you happen to be having a picnic under a tree and you see a ghost. You are the person that sees the story of this crime. And in Bewitched, you watch a crime carried out in front of you. And the woman in that story has hanging on her wall. Let's see if I can find it. I marked it in the story. She has a motto that hangs on her wall that says something like, "The sinner dies. The soul that sinneth, it shall die." That's the opening of the story. So there's this, you can't miss it.
Yeah.
The Puritan ethos is just driving these stories. The other thing that I think is interesting, so they are relentless, and she is a master of atmosphere. Often they take place in the winter, so the cold and the storm and the snow and ice, which are all inimical to human life. Those are all big parts of these threatening people's lives. The other thread that I find in these stories is that many of them are about loneliness and about people trapped and isolated. And I can't not be aware of the fact that she was trapped and isolated in a very unhappy marriage for years. And there is this sense of desperation. The woman who's walled up in her own castle, the woman who people think is dead and who lives alone by the ocean. This feeling of terrible, endless isolation and solitude. So those are two themes, the moral theme and this punishing state of loneliness.
There's so many things to react to what you just beautifully said, Roxana, but just two things. On the one hand, I would like to say something about the puritanical spirit. And we were talking about this while we were waiting for the event to start. And then also marriage, which I think is very important. And of course, the revenant, the specter coming to redress some sort of crime makes one think immediately of Hamlet and the family relations that are there. But about Bewitched, I thought it was a fascinating story, and it's the most sort of Ethan Frome-esque story in the collection. I thought I feel there's a very strong connection between those two texts, not just because of the wintry setting, not only because of the stern morality involved in both these stories, but also I feel that both of these stories are very complicated in terms of class. We are in general used to Wharton writing about this rarefied sort of New York world, and both Ethan Frome and Bewitched take place in sort of in a working class environment very clearly. And I found it very interesting to see what she does to language in this story very strongly. And this happens also to me, the scariest story of all in A Bottle of Perrier at the end, how she transcribes the sort of lower class speech. That to me was very fascinating, and I think there's a lot to be done with that. Also, I would say there is a connection between, and we think of Wharton as a novelist of manners, right? And I think there is no. Well, you don't. Okay, but why?
Oh, I just think it's a diminishing term. It's a demeaning term. I think you wouldn't call Tolstoy a novelist of manners. She writes about
Oh,
the
I
same.
would. So we
Oh, okay.
disagree on both spectrums.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, all right. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, please. No. This is what it's all about. I think manners don't have to do just with politesse. I think manners, the way I view them, have to do with a hyper reified system of conduct. And it has to do with almost tectonic layers of mediation between people, and the impossibility of relating immediately, the impossibility of direct contact, direct touch between people. It has to do with all these circumventions, and the pun is quite intended. So there are these conventions that have to be, that you have to go around to hopefully maybe get to touch someone. And this is the way I view manners and this is the way I view manners in Henry James as well. And I think the complication of human relations come from this extremely reified mediations that separates them. And I think there is a connection between manners understood in this particular way and ghosts, because manners rely on a certain form of repression, and what cannot be said. This is at the core, I think, of manners understood in this sense, the unspoken. And the unspoken has a very heavy spectral load, I think.
I guess to sort of elaborate on that is, what is the relationship, do you think, in Wharton and maybe more generally, between the idea of manners and the idea of morality? I mean, is there a connection between these two domains? Are they?
I don't know. I think it's and I'm sorry, Roxana, we landed on manners. You must be very happy.
Well, I'd be. I mean, I have a different view.
Yeah. No. Would you?
Well, so I'm interested by what you say about the reification of behavior, but I don't think that has anything to do with manners. I think, or at least I don't think it has anything to do with a certain class or of manners. Everybody in every class has established a certain method of dealing with people. Everybody in every class is afraid of certain kinds of knowledge. There's certain things that are too frightening to hear the answers to. They're questions that we don't ask, no matter who you are, no matter what your class is. You don't have to be brought up to use a napkin to be afraid that your father doesn't love you. And you can't ask the question that will be answered in that way. So I think every kind of human family, every kind of human interaction is based on a series of risk avoidance and generosity and fear. And those things have nothing to do with manners as we think of them, but it's a system that everybody evolves in order to protect themselves and also allow themselves to exist in the world among other people. But I find, I mean, I'm interested by your description, but I find that generally when people say so-and-so is a novelist of manners, there's some kind of diminishment implied, that they're not a novelist of ideas, for example, which I think Wharton is, and so is Tolstoy, and of other things as well. I think that both of them deal with the problems, the risks, and the terrors, and the dangers of human emotion. And I think that's and both of them take very seriously the culture in which humans exist. Tolstoy is always trying to figure out a way to reach people and can't, but the same is true of I don't know, Faulkner. Who do you think is not a novelist of manners? Somebody who works outside the system of manners. I think everyone works within a system of their own making that involves the way you deal with other people.
To sort of ask something then about categorization, I think would be interesting. And one of the things that potentially I think could be a landmark with this republication from New York Review of Book Classics is thinking about Wharton as the author of specifically supernatural tales. And this is something that I think a lot of readers who are not as familiar with Wharton's writing and kind of know her more through the stereotyped view would be surprised from. I know I was surprised to learn about how much she wrote that was kind of spectral or ghostly. So I guess, how do we fit her into like a genealogy of American ghost stories, basically? I mean, you mentioned Hawthorne. I'm curious about her relationship. Though she sort of dismissed the influence with Henry James, how do we think about her in relation to somebody like Poe? How do we teach? I guess, and this is my inner professor. How do we teach Wharton as an author of stories of hauntings?
Well, I think we're touching on the strength behind it. I think both Hernan and I are talking about. I mean, for me, she evokes emotion in a very powerful way and incredibly elegant. So she's balancing these two issues, of one of tremendous fear and the other of tremendous elegance, and maintaining this, that every sentence is perfectly structured, every set of words works with each other. So just her style alone is makes the stories worth reading. But I think that she's not writing in an American tradition. I think she's writing in an English tradition of ghost stories, and she refers to some of them in the preface and says, "I wouldn't dream of putting myself alongside them." And it made me want to go back and reread some of the great classic ghost stories that the English wrote. They are, as I remember them, like A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which is about an archaeological dig, and somebody finds a whistle and he takes it back to his hotel room and he nearly goes mad. And that's kind of a crime. It's clearly a crime that he's committed against the culture that they're digging up. But it's not like the crimes in Wharton's stories. These are really serious personal acts that are carried out against somebody within the story. And so you become trapped in this, and you understand the commission of this immoral act, and you understand it's a crime that must be paid for. It's paying for. It's the consequences that takes over in these stories. So one of my favorites is it Kerfiel? I don't know how you pronounce it, that Norman Kerfall, and the dogs. And it's a chilling story about the consequences of cruelty. So she twists this silken rope around the throat of these characters so that by the end you are speechless. To Hernan's point about class, she certainly goes back and forth between the circle that she knows, that we know that she grew up in. But she writes about, at some point in one of her letters, she says, the people in these woods around Lenox, which is where she built her house in Massachusetts, they tell stories that you wouldn't believe. And she dips into this other culture in Ethan Frome and in her novel Summer, and in this story Bewitched, as Hernan says. I don't think that they're very authentic. I don't think those characters have the same sense of realism that the stories that are drawn from her own world have. It always feels to me as though she's slumming a bit. She's sort of saying, I know more than you do. I can tell your story better than you can. So they make me uncomfortable. Bewitched, I think, is extraordinary just because it is so straightforward. It's just the soul who sins, he shall die. It's just, she comes right out with it. But I don't think, for me, in general, those texts are not as successful as the ones in which she writes about her own world.
Yeah, I agree. And to shift at your premise, your pedagogical sort of question, how do we teach? To which I have no answer, and that's why I'm shifting it. It's reading these stories, and I'm going to say something that is not. I mean, that I probably regret. Except for the last story, which freaked me out, a bottle of Evian, and I saw it was published as a bottle of Perrier vice versa. So I wonder why she switched brands of mineral water. I'm very curious about that. But that story aside, to me, these stories were not so much about fear, or she talks about, you know, the chill down the spine. She has this very funny, in the preface, she says the ghost stories should be evaluated according to the temperature or something like that. She puts it very wittily. I didn't feel that chill. To me, the stories were secondly about ghosts. In the first place, they were about perception. At the core of almost all of these stories is how indecidable it is to say that we have in fact witnessed something. The notion of witnessing is at the core of most of these stories. And I don't think it's a sheer coincidence that so many of these stories are framed stories. So we're further removed from sort of the supposed empirical reality of what took place in the past. So there are layers of removal, narrative removal. There is also time in many stories. A lot of time has gone by. In another story, in other stories, she overtly says that there were no direct witnesses. In other stories, it's a manuscript, like in the French story with the dogs. In other stories, there are letters that are smudged and almost illegible. So I think the question is, what is this strangeness? And by the way, because the book took a little while to arrive, I got the PDF file before I got the book. And reading the book, I noticed that queer was a word that appeared almost all the time in every single story. And then I went back to the PDF and ran a search and corroborated this. It appears almost 40 times in the book and in every story. And I think, so to me, what's at stake in these stories is this queerness. It's this strangeness, this impossibility to establish, in fact, what has happened, this ambiguity. So I think point of view here is doing a lot of work in all of these stories. They are stories to a large extent about point of view. So in that regard, yes, I would say I see a very Jamesian kind of imprint in these stories, but also to bring back Poe that you mentioned a while ago, sort of the unreliability of the narrator, which I think, you know, Poe was one of the first to give us in the American tradition. Yeah.
I wonder, Roxana, you'd mentioned sort of, you know, that you consider Wharton to be working in this English tradition of the ghost story. Very broadly, what would you say is the difference between English and an American tradition or approach towards ghost stories?
Well, I have to say, I can't think of a lot of American ghost stories. So I don't know what that tradition would be. And I think that Wharton was so closely connected to English literature and that tradition, that's what she grew up reading. And there is a big group of English ghost writers around the turn of the last century. And her stories, to me, reflect those stories. So I think they have to do with the past and some kind of violation and some kind of risk. But often it's just the atmosphere. There's one in which heat, takes place in London, and the heat is extraordinary, and somebody goes out wandering and he finds himself in the small hours of the night outside a stonemason's house, and the stonemason is carving a gravestone, and he's carved the man's name, and he's carving his dates of birth and death, and he has carved the date of today as the death date. And so the last line in the story is, the heat is enough to drive one mad. So you can understand what's going to happen, but there is no crime. There is no reason for this. But Wharton takes it into a Puritan landscape in which crime and morality and consequences play the driving force in a way that I don't remember the English stories doing.
I was definitely fascinated when earlier on you were talking about the kind of moral function of the ghosts, and something that hadn't really occurred to me before, but makes complete sense after you pointed it out, was how often the hauntings of these particular ghosts only makes sense in terms of who they happen to be haunting, right? So like an afterward, for example. I mean, if the ghost in that story appeared to anyone other than the husband in that story, it would be an irrelevant specter, right? Like it only matters in terms of the kind of, I guess, moral or ethical function that it serves. And one of the things, and to kind of just jump off from that particular story, but one of the things that interested me so much with a lot of these is I agree that they're about loneliness in some way, but they're also about a very particular type of loneliness, I thought, which comes from waiting. Like so many of these stories are about the characters like waiting for something to happen. And and sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, but she conveys that kind of like low thrumming anxiety or dread that we oftentimes have. My wife said, because she was reading the book alongside me, that it conveys the emotion that you have like when you're waiting for like a result from your doctor, you're waiting for that phone call, right? Like there's always that kind of like, and it's a couple hours later than you'd think they'd actually call you for. So it was just trying to tabulate some of the ones. In All Souls, you have that kind of terrifying convalescence. You have Mary Boyne and Afterward waiting, for her word of her husband. Obviously, Charlotte Ashby and Pomegranate Seed waiting to hear about her husband and so on. So I guess I don't want my question to be like, what do you think about my hypothesis? But how much are these stories about waiting, and how much is haunting in a more general sense about the status of waiting?
Well, I think that's spot on what you just said, and I would add my favorite, the bottle of Perrier too. It's long waiting, and it felt almost like a Dino Buzzati story or a Kafka story. It's immensely. There's something else going on there that is phenomenal. But I think waiting, perhaps I will venture this. Waiting is so central in most of these stories because I feel that ghosts are waiting. They are these half presences that are in suspension. They're neither here nor there. They're caught halfway. There's something in ghosts that seem to be awaiting some kind of resolution, or they're expecting to be freed from their spectral condition. So I think the waiting is I would think inherent to the spectral condition, but also I think waiting and haunting and ghosting, all of these things have to do with also something we haven't mentioned yet, with domestic spaces, and haunting is always linked to a particular house. There is, I forget the title, they want to buy in one of these stories in the volume, they want to buy a house with their own ghost, and it all starts as a joke, and boy do they get it. But
that's Afterward.
Yeah, that's right. So I think houses, to my mind, are one of the great protagonists of these stories, and in so many of them, houses are presented as witnesses. The house was looking at her. She and the old house should have time to make friends. There is this very personal relationship between the characters and the houses that are anthropomorphized to an enormous extent. And this is fairly commonplace, but it's interesting to note that guest and host are etymologically exactly the same word from Latin, hostis, which is also enemy. So I find that triangulation, as in hostility, right? It's the exact same root as in host or in guest. And I think that is at play in all these stories. Who is the host? Is it the living people who live there, or are they actually the interlopers and the hostile presences? Who is hosting whom, and who is the true guest here, or the enemy? So I think, this impossibility to determine who belongs in which realm is very, and also like free associating, I don't think it's a coincidence that, Freud thinks of the home when he talks about the unheimlich, so the home is a crucial aspect in haunting and in the weird and in the queer, understood as Wharton. I mean, I think queer and unheimlich are very, very close terms in this regard. Yeah.
I would go back to the idea of loneliness, because I agree with Hernan about the presence of ghosts being sort of a lonely presence in the world. But I think loneliness on the part of these characters is a driving force. It's just as important as winter, the storms, the loneliness of the landscape. Loneliness sets up these characters so that they are in a state of heightened awareness, heightened vulnerability. And so many of them are about that. I marked them. All Souls is about them. The Lady's Maid's Bell, Kerfol, Miss Mary Passed, Mr. Jones, Pomegranate Seed. They're all about people who are either alone or afraid of being alone. And that sense of solitude brings terror. So Kerfol, especially, that poor woman whose husband, I won't spoil it and say what she did, but there are often women in states of really dire situations, extreme loneliness. They're not physically damaged, but they are in intolerable states. And as I say, it seems to me like an echo of Wharton's own situation, in which she was married to a man that she became increasingly intolerant of, and he was intolerant of her. It was a state that was unbearable to her. She finally divorced him, but for, I think, 20 years, she lived with somebody, a life in which she was strapped into the same vehicle with someone who was her enemy, became her enemy. So there is that sense of an intolerable state that many of these characters share. And so Wharton draws on that notion of a state that cannot be borne, an unbearable condition that permeates these stories and fills them with a kind of desperation.
Can I add something very quickly to that? I think that's beautiful. And there is in Mr. Jones, one of the longer stories, I think, in the book, this is barely a spoiler, but it speaks so clearly, Roxana, to what you just said, when the narrator starts unearthing the story behind the house again. Oh, and it shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, Wharton's first book was The Decoration of Houses, which she wrote with Ogden Codman. So this whole thing, it weighs heavily, I think, in her life and in her corpus. But the little quote I wanted to read to you is, it's this wife again who is under the heavy fist of a tyrannical husband, and Wharton writes, they discovered that she was deaf and dumb, and she writes, day after day, winter after winter, year after year, speechless, soundless, alone, which is crushing. And I think so many of the strands that we're discussing come together there. We have the winter, right? We have the wait, day after day, year after year. We have the silence, speechless, soundless. And we have a woman and a wife in this immensely oppressive situation where she does not literally have a voice.
Yeah, beautifully put. Absolutely. That's a great quote.
I think it might be a nice time to switch to some of the audience questions. We've had a couple great ones coming in. Rather predictably, Henry James is on a lot of people's minds. So for better or for worse. So I'll dive right into some of these. Flickr asks, and this is for Roxana in particular, wouldn't you say that James also has the moral theme and often the punishing state of loneliness?
I don't think Henry James depends on morality the way Wharton does. I don't think it's the skeleton beneath his books the way it is for Wharton. I do think loneliness is a big part of his writing. I do think he felt separate from society in a way that she does because of her marriage, and he does for other reasons. But I don't think punishment is this central, integral part of his work, the way it is of Wharton's.
Hernan, what do you think about the Henry James morality question?
Oh, which is gone now. Oh, it's answered. Sorry. Gosh, I don't know. I feel a little uncomfortable with the term morality. I don't know exactly what to do with it, to be honest. It's really complicated. I do think that in some James stories, there is a tendency also toward punishment in that regard. I don't know. I think the interesting thing, what interests me about many of James's stories is that many of his characters create their own punishment for themselves and in a very bleak way welcome it or walk toward that punishing fate. And I think there is a great deal of sad beauty in that I don't think necessarily conforms to an idea of morality as we have been understanding it here in this sort of Calvinist sense. I think there's something else, something darker, something more perverse going on there, something that of the order of sort of jouissance almost, you know, of seeking that doom. And but I don't think it has necessarily to do with redemption. I don't think it's a redemptive quality necessarily in James. This is a vast question. I'm sorry if I was vague.
Well, and this is Anne Schetzer asks, and this sort of reverses, I guess, the question of influence a bit, is do we have any sense of what Henry James thought of Edith Wharton's ghost stories that you know of?
I don't know the answer.
I don't know.
Yeah, it would be because they were friends, right? James and
they were friends, but he was a good deal older than she was. And at the time when she makes this comment about his work and Hawthorne's, she says rather tartly, I haven't been able to read his work for 20 years. So she is dissociating herself from him. And when she first met him, she was an eager young acolyte and very, very respectful of him. But by the time she's writing in her stride in the teens and 20s and 30s, she's well beyond him as an influence. They were friends, but she thought of herself as a very different kind of writer. She didn't want to be twinned with him.
That's interesting. I always feels like I don't know enough about it, obviously, but almost like an anxiety of influence kind of thing. Or do you think that she was correct in her?
Well, I think from this point of view, it's very tempting to twin them because they both wrote about the same world. Mm. They were both American upper class and moved in very elevated circles. And they dealt with niceties, as Hernan says, about manners and about beautiful houses and the way you ought to behave. But they really were doing very different things. And she became impatient with the idea that they were paired. So I don't myself think of them as a twinned set. And I also think any writer, any artist resists being identified as the offshoot of somebody else, or, you know, this was if without this writer, I couldn't have been a writer myself. She wouldn't admit to that. No one would.
Sure. This is another sort of influence question, not about Henry James, though, so we'll move on from him, but a question that we could maybe also think in a broader way and kind of pair Wharton with people who read her. Paul Russell asks if there's any awareness of if Shirley Jackson had read any of Wharton's ghost stories, and if there's possibly an influence on something like The Haunting of Hill House.
I don't know the answer.
It's always tough with these kind of influence questions, right? Because we have to if we don't have access to the archive or something. There's another question that's similar to this. I don't know if it's anything that we would know more about, but I think it's an interesting question. if she had any awareness of H.P. Lovecraft, so very different sort of author. And I don't know, maybe if you could speak more generally, I guess, to kind of important differences between those sorts of writers.
I wonder, would that have been like even chronologically possible? Wharton died, I think, in 37.
37, yeah.
He was writing in the 20s. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Who knows? I think she would have detested his writing.
I would think so too. The snobbishness, though, is definitely shared, I think. I feel like Wharton's one of those writers that if you just casually think about it, I think of her as being older than she is, and I think of Lovecraft as being more recent somehow. So there's that kind of, aphasia or whatever with that. This is an interesting one from Carrie Langan. Asks, Wharton was of English and Dutch ancestry, but she spoke of my intense Celtic sense of the supernatural. So what do you think she means about that? And that might be something worth talking about as well in the preface, that very odd portion where she talks about the kind of like Latin inability to understand the supernatural.
I think she says in one of the stories that Dorsetshire and Devonshire were full of ghosts. So I think she's not eliminating, she thinks the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish all have a very close affinity for the supernatural. But I don't think she would divide herself from that group. Obviously, she doesn't. But yeah, she says it's, this is my group and I know who they are and nobody else understands us the way we do.
Hernan, what did you think of that? I thought it was such a strange.
Of what, sorry?
This sort of her sense of like the Celtic supernatural, this kind of odd argument about who can appreciate these ghost stories.
Yeah, I'm going to take a diagonal approach to that question. There's a story in the collection that we barely spoke about that to me is one of the most interesting story, and that is The Eyes, which is a story that revolves very clearly around homosexuality, and which is the ghostly presence in the story. It's what's unsaid. It's a group of men who love good food and rare wines, who get together, and one of them tells this story about he basically stood up his fiance, went to Rome, and met this beautiful young boy. Compared to Antinous, there are endless references and winks and even puns. I compiled a little list, and I think perhaps because you mentioned the Roman, and most of the story takes place in Italy, and I think it's probably very meaningful that the most complicated story in terms of propriety, to put it somehow, takes place in this non-Celtic, non-Anglo, but quite literally Latinate world. So I think, and this probably brings us back to the discussion about Puritanism and how we have different moral strains at work in these stories, and what kind of contexts allow her to say certain kinds of things.
So that's so interesting about that story. I hadn't seen it in that way, but of course you're right. There are all those chords and strains, but it's also, it seems to me, it's about two possible crimes this man could have committed. He could have committed the crime of marrying that woman, which clearly would have been an emotional crime. He didn't love her. It would be a kind of a sin against, against her to create a marriage that would be so loveless. And then with the boy, and I agree with you that it's hard to read that sort of current of affection in any other way. But it seems to me that the crime he commits there is to tell the boy untruthfully that he's a good artist, so that the great crime he does commit is against art itself. he's telling the boy, yes, you're wonderful. You should keep on this terrible work, turning out this trash that you're turning out. And I will be your mentor and guide and tell you that you are a true artist, which he isn't. So that there are two, it seems to me, two currents. One that you're talking about is sexuality, but the other is a sort of a crime against art.
Sort of a interesting, unless Hernan, did you want to follow up on that, or I can?
Oh, yeah, I agree. I mean, the name of the narrator is Colwyn, spelled Cool-Win. From there on, the puns, yes, the puns pile on and on and on. I refuse to believe that that is just an accident.
No, I don't. I'm not.
Yeah, no. And sorry. And then the young boy is called Noise, spelled no yes. And I think that is the ambiguity that goes through this entire story. He says no to his fiancée and says yes to Noise, the young boy. And I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe he sees these ominous eyes only after he actually tells the boy the truth, that he's a terrible artist, that he's utterly hopeless. But I could be mistaken.
Okay, so one of us has read it wrong. I think he sees the eyes when he's at risk of committing the crime in each case of inauthenticity. And he sees the eyes while he's still engaged to that hapless young woman. And so the eyes are telling him, this is what you will turn into, this wicked old roue with these terrible eyes, if you marry her. And the eyes come to him when he tells the boy that he's a good artist. He shouts, no, you're all wrong and it's all right. He says that, and he comes out and tells the boy a falsehood. And that's when he sees the eyes. Is that right? Or am I remembering it?
I'm sure I'm wrong. But just the way in which he describes the eyes throughout this, they looked like sea pebbles in the grip of a starfish. I mean, come on. It's wonderful. And the descriptions of the eyes in that story in general are absolutely incredible. I should also say that eyes is yes. So there is a whole thing about yes and no, and that indeterminacy in the story, I think.
You have time. Oh,
yeah. No, please go.
We have time for about one more question, and here's a great one from Catherine Eaton. She asks, there's a strong leaning in Wharton's ghost stories of the underdogs, quite literally in Kerfall, having the last say. That might be a particular American flavor that I think is lacking in English ghost stories. Would you say that contemplation of the downtrodden and disenfranchised is a major theme in Wharton's work?
I would not. I think she's interested in characters who are, I mean, Lily Bart is not exactly downtrodden. She's a member of a very elevated social circle. She loses everything. And so she becomes somebody who's an outsider. And she was originally the quintessential insider. So she becomes sort of a lost soul. But I wouldn't say that she's interested in sort of social justice and raising poor people to a level of where rich people are. I don't think that's her intention. I think she's more interested in, as I say, the consequences of people's actions. But I don't think she's interested in social justice. That's my sense. What would you say, Hernan?
I agree, and I would even take it a notch further. I don't think Wharton honestly believes in that great American myth that is class mobility. I find that pretty consistently people who overstep their station are viewed as vulgar, nouveau riche, objectionable. Custom of the country is all about that to an enormous extent. Whereas you know, old money can't be made in Wharton. Money has always already been there.
That's true.
And that is an enormous, it's never capital, it's just treasure. And those are two very different notions.
That's good. I like that.
A wonderful note to end on. I'm really sorry to interrupt. I would love to hear all of your answers to all of these wonderful questions we have in the chat, but I think it's fair to let everyone get on with their evenings. So thank you very much again for this conversation. Those of you at home, please consider purchasing a copy of Ghosts from Community Bookstore. We hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. There it is. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you, guys. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.